Hello and welcome to the Networking Fundamentals Mastering IP Addressing in 1 Hour webinar, presented by Microsoft MCT and Train Signal instructor Ed Liberman. I'm Stephanie Swift from Train Signal, and I'd like to take a minute to tell you what to expect in the next hour. I'd like to draw your attention to the questions box in your webinar control panel. Ed will be answering questions today, so please submit any questions you think of during the presentation. Also, if you have any technical difficulties, let us know in the questions box and we'll do our best to assist you. Today's presentation will be recorded and available to view tomorrow. We'll email the link to you after the presentation. After you exit the webinar, you'll be prompted to take a short survey. Train Signal wants to hear from you, so please take a few minutes to complete the survey. We'll also choose one participant from today's audience to receive a copy of our CompTIA Network Plus training course. But you do have to complete the survey to be eligible to win, so be sure to fill out that quick survey after today's webinar. Also, if you have any additional comments or feedback, you can send an email to webinars@trainsignal.com. With that, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, and here's Ed.
Thanks, Stephanie, and hello, everyone. Glad you could be here. I'm gonna start right off before saying anything else. Just gonna kind of let you know I personally am a little bit under the weather today, so I want to apologize if I sound a little nasally. I have a little bit of a cold that I'm fighting, but we'll get through this, I'm sure. With that, again, welcome to TCP/IP addressing, and we have a lot to cover in this webinar. I know it doesn't look like much from what I have here. Right, I just have working with IP addresses, planning an IP addressing scheme, working with binary numbers. I know that's the favorite part for most people. Internetworking, and then classful versus classless interdomain routing. Just sounds like 5 simple things, but I will tell you this is a lot of information. I'm going to have to move fairly quickly through this information. I'm going to let you know right up front that you may, at some point, I may start to lose you. Just hang in there, grasp what you can. Remember that this is being recorded, and you can go back and watch it again if you need to. But I do know from experience that this is just a lot to take in really fast, and if you've never seen this stuff before, you might find yourself just kind of getting a little bit lost, and rather than allowing that to happen, just kind of take a deep breath and forget about whatever you thought we were on and just come right back to where we are. So just a very quick introduction into who I am. I'm just your regular, typical computer geek who's worked in technology for over 20 years. More specifically, I've been certified in instructing IT professionals for, well, let's see, is it still 13 years? I think I'm almost going on 14 years now. You see I got a lot of alphabet soup that I've acquired over the years, because that's what us trainers do. We go out and we see these certification tests that go with a lot of the stuff that we're teaching, and as we do that, we acquire these certifications. Most specifically, I'd like to point out that I'm an MCT, Microsoft Certified Trainer, as Stephanie had mentioned. So that means that Microsoft certifies me to teach this stuff to you. One little side note, something I like to tell everybody about me is when I'm not doing what I do as a professional, I like to volunteer my time in the local community as a math tutor for struggling grade school children. And the reason why, and more specifically the reason why this is important that I tell you, is I want you to know the kind of guy I am. I get satisfaction in life. I get enjoyment in life out of helping people. And I tell people all the time, I tell my children this, the key to true success and happiness is finding something that you love to do, and then, of course, finding somebody who's willing to pay you to do it. And so I'm fortunate enough that I found something that I love to do. I love helping people. And, the fact that I can come to things like this and help, hopefully help anyway, those of you who are listening and watching today, and help people who are watching my courses and get paid to do it, well, that's just a wonderful thing. So the only last thing here is just so you understand what my current position is right now, what I currently do professionally with my life is I am the lead Windows Server instructor for Train Signal. So if you have purchased any of our courses, any of the Windows Server 2008 stuff, pretty much has my name tied to it one way or another. In the future, I'm already beginning the process of looking into what's currently called Windows Server 8, That's its beta name. It may be Server 2012 or something like that once it finally comes out at the end of the year. But I'll be involved with creating those courses as well. Now, real quick before we go any further, I would like to put you all to work. Now that I've told you just a little bit about me, I want to know a little bit about you. And don't worry, this is real simple. I want to start off with I want to know where you're from. Okay, I want to know what continent you're from. I'm only listed with 5 choices here, so I had to kind of push this down. And again, I'll emphasize continent. I've had people in the past point out to me that they're from New Zealand, not Australia. But you know, again, I just had to put down the continents. So I just want to get an idea here of where my audience is right now. And it looks like a number of you have already voted. I'm going to give you just a few more seconds here, and then I'm going to close the voting, and we'll take a look at where everyone's from. All right, looks like everyone's pretty much in. And what do we have? Well, looks like about 3/4 of you are from North America, where I'm from as well. We got a couple people from, or a couple percentage points, I should say. Looks like could be maybe 3 people from South America. That's great. 13% from Europe. Have 1% from Australia. Can't help but wonder if that 1% is Australia or New Zealand. You can always throw that in the question box if you want to let me know. And we have 10% from the other 3 continents. And I always wonder if any of that is from Antarctica. Just once, I want somebody from Antarctica to be part of our webinars. Okay, great. One other question I want to ask you guys is I want to know whether you are at all familiar with me or my material. Okay, so I just want to know whether you have seen any of my stuff before, whether it be specific courses that I've done or free lessons out on our website, or maybe other webinars that I've done, or maybe this is the first time you're ever dealing with this nutcase that they call Ed Liberman, and if so, well, great. Hopefully I can convert you into a fan. But anyway, like I said before, I'm going to give you just a few more moments here to answer the question and let me know. And the reason, by the way, I want to know this is it just gives me an idea of, you know, whether I'm just repeating myself, stuff that you've already heard before. Maybe need to come up with some new material, some new jokes for those of you that have heard all the same jokes again and again. Anyway, let me go ahead and close this poll, and let's go ahead and look at the results. And it looks like a little over half of you are brand new to Ed Liberman, that's great, great that you're here. And again, hopefully by the end, I haven't scared you away. Looks like a small percentage of you have seen my Network Plus course, which I'll tell you that this lesson that we're going to go through here is pretty much from that course. So one big difference here before you go running off and go, oh great, I've already seen this before, is here's an opportunity to ask me questions which you weren't able to do when you saw the course. Looks like a little over 20% of you have seen my Microsoft stuff, so that's great. And 14% with the free lessons, and 6% seen other webinars. I'm guessing some of that 6% probably was with me last month doing the OSI model, which was also from the same general material. Wonderful. All right, so let's go ahead and jump back into the presentation and let's learn about IP addressing. All right, so when it comes to working with IP addresses, we need to start off and ask the question, what exactly is an IP address? Right? Heard of this thing. People talk about it all the time. IP address. IP address. What's your IP address? Go to that IP address, right? We keep hearing that. What is it? Well, an IP address is a 32-bit address that is used to uniquely identify a computer on a network. Okay, so what it means is it's an address. It's an identifier for a computer. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a computer. I've had people ask me that question before as far as if it were a host versus a computer versus some people ask about a node. Let's not get into those specifics, but it's an identifier of a computer on a network. Just to keep it real simple, we'll say computer. And here's something very, very specific I want you to know about the IP address. One thing that we know is that the network ID portion of the IP address, and really I should start off by saying there are two components to an IP address. I know it looks like 4 numbers with dots, but there's 2 components. There's the network ID component, and this is the portion that identifies what network the computer is on. And then the other component is the host ID. And this portion of the IP address uniquely identifies the computer within that network. Now here's the other thing that we know. We know that the network ID portion is the left side of an IP address, and we know that the host ID portion is the right side of an IP address. But where we draw the line is where things get a little bit tricky, and that's what we're going to learn today. So here we have an IP address, right? We have an example of 192.168.10.1, and again, the network ID is on the left and the host ID is on the right. But where do we draw the line? Where we draw that line is determined by something called a subnet mask. Here we have a subnet mask that says 255.255.255.0. And with that subnet mask, for right now, we're going to keep it real simple. We're going to say anywhere there's a 255, that represents the network ID. And anywhere that there's a 0, that represents the host ID. Okay, so that's the portion of the IP address. So in this example, I've kind of color-coded this for you. Hopefully you're not colorblind. If you are, I apologize because I have been told that the colors that I'm using aren't bold enough for people who are colorblind. So I apologize if any of you are colorblind. But the 192.168.10 portion of the IP address is the network ID, and then just 1, right? Just that .1 at the end, that's the host ID. So what that's saying is, in this example, if this computer had this IP address and subnet mask, that 192.168.10 is the network that that computer lives on, and 1 is the identifier on that network. But guess what? It doesn't have to be that way. That might be the most common way that we see this. But we could have easily made the subnet mask 255.255.0.0, and that means that the network ID is simply 192.168. That's the identifier of the network, and then 10.1 is the identifier for the individual host or the individual computer on that network. And of course, we could even bring it one step further and say it's just 255.0.0.0, which means it's just the 192 network, and everything else is a host on that network. Now, if you haven't figured this out, one of the key importances to this is that the larger the network ID, the more networks there are, but the fewer hosts there can be on that network. Whereas when you have a smaller network ID, like the example on the screen right now, it's just simply the 192 network. We don't have very many of those, but we have a lot of hosts that can be on the network because the last 3 numbers can all represent that identifier. Now, by the way, this is the first point where people already will begin to go, all right, I'm lost. And there's no real easy way around it. There's a lot of analogies that I've used as far as things like, think of it as like the network ID is the street that you live on, and the host is the number of the house on that street. There's a lot of things like that. But basically, we need to go through these basics, and by the end, this should all come together. So here I have a diagram of just a real simple network. Okay, the idea is we have the internet, and we have our firewall router, and then we've got a server and a client, right? Just kind of represents everything. And I just want to show you that the server has an IP address of 192.168.10.201 with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, which means it's on the 192.168.10 network. And the client has an IP address of 192.168.10.101 with the same subnet mask, which means, again, it's on the 192.168.10 network. So both those computers are on the same network, but the client has an identifier of 101, and the server has an identifier of 201. And along those same lines, and we'll talk about routers a little bit later, we have a router here that is 192.168.10 with the subnet mask that's the same, so that's the network it's on, with a unique identifier on that network of 200. So that means these two computers, the client and the server, can communicate with the router. Now again, don't worry about it, just kind of, this will all be pieced together by the end. So, if we find ourselves in a situation where we need to put together an IP addressing scheme, right? We need to determine for our network, for our company, for our house, for our whatever, we need to have a bunch of IP addresses so that the computers can talk to one another. What do we need to look at? Well, the first thing is we need to determine how many IP addresses do we need right now. Because we're going to see how we calculate that out. But again, remember, the smaller the host ID, the fewer IP addresses that you can have on that network. So how many do I need today? How many will I need in the future? You always want to plan for growth. You don't want to just say, well, I need 200 right now, so there's a block of 200 and we're good. Well, what happens tomorrow when you got 250? Well, now you're in trouble. Okay, so it's how many will we need in the future? And then are you dealing with a pre-existing IP scheme? Very often you'll walk into a company who already has a network in place, already has a bunch of IP addresses, and you have to figure out how to work with that. You know, are we going to just completely wipe everything clean and start over again, which can be a real challenge and usually makes for a very long weekend, right? Because you can't do it during business hours because you got to take everything down and reconfigure and bring it back up. Or are we able to work with what we have and just make some modifications? Now, there are some rules when it comes to IP addressing, and we're going to see this come up a couple times here. Real quick here, some of this stuff won't fully be explained until we get to the second time, but right here we have some rules. Each of the four numbers in an IP address, right, because we have 192, 168, 10, and 101. That's four different numbers with a dot in between them, right? Each one of those four numbers is actually called an octet. And the reason we call it an octet is because even though we see it as the decimal numbers that we see in front of us, or base 10 numbers is another way of saying it, numbers that we are all familiar with typically as average humans, the reality is that an IP address is made up of these four 8-bit binary numbers. Okay, so even though it says 192, it's actually a representation of 8 ones and zeros, okay, an 8-bit binary number. Okay, and that's what the bit is, 1 or 0. Now, each octet can only have a number from 0 to 255. And the reason will be explained when we get to the math portion later, but the reason is because if we had all zeros, right, if we had 8 zeros, that equals 0, and if we had 8 ones and then calculated that back to a decimal number, you get 255, okay, and everything else is in between. And that's why all IP addresses, you see a number from 0 to 255. Some additional rules that you need to keep in mind is that the first octet cannot be 127. The 127 range has been reserved for diagnostics. 127.0.0.1 is known as the loopback address, or sometimes it also is called local host, means yourself. If a network card is pointing to 127.0.0.1, it's pointing back to itself. It's looping back to itself. And it's kind of a shame that this entire range has been reserved because that's a lot of IP addresses, almost 17 million IP addresses that can't be used for diagnostics. And the reality is only a small handful of them are actually used for diagnostics. Some additional rules. Our host ID cannot be all zeros, and for right now we're going to say all 255s. For any of you who have studied any of this before, you know that the 255s means all ones. Okay, so host ID cannot be all zeros or 255s. All zeros would represent the network ID, and all 255s represents a broadcast address. So for instance, if you were to see 192.168.10.0, that is a representation of the network ID for the 192.168.10 network. 192.168.10.255 is the broadcast address for the 192.168.10 network. And so if you had a transmission, if you were on that 192.168.10 network and you wanted to broadcast something out to everyone else on that network, well, then you would go ahead and send it to the address 192.168.10.255. Now, originally, when all of this was created, IP addresses were divided into different class ranges. And we're going to see in a little bit how this caused a problem. You're probably getting sick of me saying we're going to see in a little bit, we're going to see in a little bit, right? I keep promising you, we're going to see stuff in a little bit. I promise you, we will see all of it, everything I'm talking about. These class ranges caused a problem, and let's see if we can see what it is. First of all, the Class A range of IP addresses. These were IP addresses where the first octet was the network ID, and the last 3 octets represented the host ID. But to be more specific, they were represented by IP addresses that started with anything from 1 to 126. Okay, so if the first number in the first octet was a 1 all the way through to 126, that was known as a Class A IP address. And the reality was, is in some cases, you didn't even need the subnet mask. It was an assumed subnet mask. It was assumed that if your IP address started with anything from 1 to 126, you were part of Class A. So boom, that's it. Your subnet mask is 255.0.0.0. The Class B range, the first octet will be 128 to 191. But in this case, the first 2 octets represent the network ID, and the last 2 represent the host ID. And then we had our Class C range, where we had 192 to 223, representing those Class C addresses. Okay, and that would be the number in the first octet. But in a Class C IP range, the first 3 octets are your network ID, and the last octet is your host ID. Now we also had, well, we still have Class D, which is if the first number is 224 to 239, and these were reserved for multicast transmissions, and Class E, which was for experimental. Okay, we're not going to worry about those. For right now, we're just going to worry about A, B, and C. Now, if you had a Class A IP range, how many of those were there? Well, there were 126, right? Because the first octet was either 1 or 2 or 3, all the way up to 126. So there were 126 of them because that was the network ID, just that first number. But because we had 3 octets that we could use for our host ID, that meant that you could have 16,777,214 hosts on one of those Class A networks. Remember how I said the 127 range is reserved, right? That's reserved for diagnostics, anything that starts with 127. And I said that that's wasting almost 17 million IP addresses. Well, that's where this number came from. And I will tell you that the math is pretty easy here. If I just pull up a calculator real fast here, and I just do 256, because there's 256 possible numbers that can go into each octet, right? 0 to 255 is a total of 256 numbers that can go into each octet. And I multiply it by 256, I end up with 16,777,216. But again, remember the rules. Can't have all zeros, can't have all ones. So you have to subtract 2 And once you subtract those two, you get down to the 16,777,214 hosts. In a Class B environment, there were 16,384 of these, and each one could have 65,534. In Class C, there were 2 million of them, a little more than 2 million, but each one could only have 254 hosts. What this means is if you do all the math and you put it all together, there's a total of a little over 3, well, I shouldn't even say a little over because it's almost 4 billion. It's 3,720,314,628 hosts available. And at the time, back when this was created, back in the 70s, actually it's arguable, was this back in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, but when this was all put together, it was thought that that would be plenty, right? I mean, come on, 4 billion IP addresses? No problem. Well, it became a problem. And we'll talk about how to solve that problem, and I'll tell you what, part of the reason I keep saying we'll talk about is because we got to learn about binary. That's the part I told you everyone's always waiting for, right? The binary stuff. Before we get to that, let's talk about private versus public IP addressing. Private IP ranges are ones that have been reserved from public internet use. These ranges are 10.anything, 172.16 through 172.31, and 192.168.0 through 192.168.255. Okay, those are your Class A, B, and C private ranges. What it means is if you have an IP address that's in one of these ranges, you cannot be out on the internet. That's what it means. You can't be out on the internet. And you may be thinking to yourself right now, well, wait a minute, I've seen those IP addresses. I mean, 192.168 is one of the most commonly used IP ranges out there. I mean, it's in people's homes, businesses, it's used everywhere. And you're thinking to yourself, but I'm on the internet. So how is that possible? Well, we'll talk about that. But before we do, there is one other range I want to point out, and that is 169.254. This is something that has been reserved for automatic private IP addressing. This is not only not routable on the internet. I was trying to think of a better way to say that to you, but routable is the correct term. It's not routable on the internet, meaning you can't be on the internet with it, but it's also specifically reserved for automatic self-applying IP addresses. Now, I told you that I would explain to you how you're getting on the internet when you may have an IP address of 192.168, and that is through something called Network Address Translation, or NAT. Most of today's, I don't even want to say companies, I'm going to say home, company, anywhere, that use private IP addressing on their private networks. This is one of the ways that we resolve the situation of running out of IP addresses. Now I'm going to give you a real quick explanation as to how NAT works. Now, it's been a while since I've done this, so let's see if my drawing capabilities are still in place. But here I have a real simple network, and you'll notice that I have, and these aren't even complete because I'm noticing there's no default gateway. Out to the internet, what that client's going to do, it's going to send its request to this NAT server. Okay, so here we have a NAT server, and the NAT server has two network cards in it. On one side, it has a network card of 192.168, which can talk with the internal clients, and then on the outside, it has an actual valid live internet IP address. So what this NAT server will do is it will take the request from the client and do two things. Number one, it'll put it in its memory banks. It'll do what's called cache that request. It'll put it into its memory banks. Okay, client one was looking for XYZ website. That's the first thing it does. The second thing it does is it then converts the source IP address and makes it that the original sender is not 192.168.10.101. It changes it to say, nope, this request we're going to say is coming from me. And it sends that request out to the web server. Okay, this would be the web server hosting the website that we were looking for, XYZ website. The web server will then respond back to the NAT server, right? That's all the web server knows. The web server doesn't know where that request truly originally came from. When the NAT server gets that response back, it looks into its cache, it looks into its memory banks and says, oh, client 1 was looking for that website, so I'll go ahead and retranslate back all the IP information to our internal network and send it back to the client. So that's how NAT works. That's how you are able to use a 192.168 IP address in your home or your office or wherever and still get on the internet. There's got to be some NAT server out there that's doing that for you. Now there are 3 different ways that a computer can get an IP address. One way would be statically. This means that you literally go in and manually type in an IP address for the server. Or really I should say for the client, the server, whatever, the computer. This is kind of the original way that we used to do it way back when. Not a very much preferred way of doing it in today's world. The way we would typically do it is with something called a DHCP server, which is a server that has a pool of IP addresses for the network, and the clients all say, hey, I need an IP address, and the DHCP server says, here you go, here you go, here you go. That's a whole nother lesson though, okay? I could spend 30 minutes going through that whole process. The third way is using a PIPA, Automatic Private IP Addressing, and this is that thing that I was just talking about with the reserved 169.254 range. With a PIPA, computers can give themselves an IP address in that range. They just randomly pick one, and then they can communicate with other computers that also are within that range, but you can't get out to the internet. All right, let's take just a quick break here from information. Let your brains take just a little breather here, and let me see what questions we may have queued up here. All right, what do I have? What are wildcards? I'm not sure the context of that question. So Richard, if you could maybe clarify that, throw another question in there. I'll try to answer that for you as far as wildcards. I have a feeling that might have pertained to something I had on a slide. Let's see here. Which class does the following address belong? 10.10.11.1/24 and why? That's a wonderful question. Because the 10 address, we already said, should be class A. But the fact that we're seeing /24, and I will tell you, this is like getting to the very end of this presentation, so this is zipping us right through the whole thing. That's why it's like this is a perfect question to what this whole webinar is all about. The /24 represents that it's got a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, which would make it like a class 3, or excuse me, a class C address. I'm going to fully explain when we get to the second half of this webinar how that happens. Is the webinar only for IPv4 addressing? Yes, there will be nothing on IPv6 in this webinar. I apologize, Matt, if you were looking for IPv6. Question, if you have clients on your network and don't give them a default gateway, will it stop them from surfing the internet? For the most part, yes. And again, we haven't talked about default gateways yet, so we will get to that. Question on, wow, all kinds of stuff. Supernetting, NAT versus PAT. I'll tell you what, I'm going to actually stop with the Q&A right here because there's a lot of these questions that are going to get answered as I go through the rest of the presentation. So I'm going to come back to this. Don't worry if I didn't get to your question yet. Before we go any further, though, I do have a couple more polls for you. These are questions that I ask in the classroom all the time because we're about to get into a binary math lesson. So the first question for all of you here in the room, it's almost 200 of you. Real simple. Yes or no? Are you good at math? Just real simple. It doesn't matter if you like it or not. Just want to know, are you good at it? Okay, because a lot of people automatically assume, well, you know, those computer people, they're good at math, or if you're good at math, you're good at computers. And that's not always the case. So just another few moments here, and I want to see with this group that we have in the room. It looks like most of you have had a chance to vote, so I'm going to go ahead and close the voting. And this is fairly typical, by the way, of what I find in the classroom. About 2/3 of you say yes, and 1/3 say no. In other words, the reason we have the stereotype that math and computer people go together is, well, there is something to be said for that. There is something to be said for the part of the brain that's used and the logic involved. But 1/3 of you are not good at math, and again, that is something I usually find to be the case. Now, the reason I didn't want you to say whether you like math or not is because, well, that's my next question here. Regardless whether you're good at it or not, I don't know if you like it. Do you find math fun? So real quick, yes or no. And again, I'm guessing typically, now if we were in a room and I had you raising your hands, I'd be able to see if it's the same people or not. Usually, the people who are not good at it also don't like it. That's usually the case. But even some of the people who are good at it, they still don't like it. I mean, I personally find math quite enjoyable, but I'm part of a definite minority in the world. Maybe not a minority in this room, because I'm going to close this poll, and you'll notice that we got the exact same numbers. There we go. 68% say yes, and 32% say no. So it's the exact same numbers that we had with who's good at math. Now, it may not have been the identical people, but pretty close to the same here. All right, well, here's the deal. The reason I wanted to ask you about math, because this is where we're going to get into a math lesson. This is where we're going to get into working with binary numbers. And I am looking at the clock, and I'm a few minutes behind where I want to be right now. We might go just a hair over the hour, but I'll try not to. I just don't want to rush through this too fast, because this is the part that most people typically come for. This is the part they want to understand. So I usually start off, and I would ask, if you were in the room with me right now, I'd say, what is this number? So I want you to look at that number and think to yourself, what's that number? And you know, wait for someone to answer, and, well, it's not a trick question. The answer is 3,482, right? That's not a trick question, right? 3,482. But why? How do we know that? How do we know it's 3,482? Well, because we learned way back in typically, back in like first, second grade, in different parts of the world, different grades, different math programs. But we learned in the decimal numbering system that we have the different column values, right? We got the ones column and the tens column and the 100s column, the thousands column. From there, we'd have the 10,000s column, the 100,000s column, and so on and so forth. And then what we do is we take, well, the number 2, right, from 3,482, and that's in the ones column. So that's 2. And by the way, I'm doing this backwards. I'm doing it from the bottom up. We got an 8 in the tens column. So 8 times 10 is 80. 4 times 100 is 400. And 3 times 1,000 is 3,000. Get all my ugly drawing off of there. And if you add that up, what do you end up with? 3,482. Isn't that magical how that happens? Now, real quick, before I have like half of you suddenly just give up on this webinar, because that sounds like a bunch of double talk. I did that for you intentionally. I didn't do it to try to look like a magician and be like, wow, look at how easy that is. No, it's because that logic right there that we just looked at is exactly how we are going to learn to convert decimal to binary and binary back to decimal. And also, by the way, for the 1/3 of you who say you're not good at math, don't worry. I'm going to show you how to do it, and all you have to know how to do is simple addition, subtraction, and then here's the real difficult part. You have to be able to multiply by 2. So if you can do those 3 things, you will be able to do what I'm about to show you. All right, when we look at our decimal numbering system, I was just talking about this a moment ago, right? We got the ones column, the tens column, the hundreds, the thousands, the 10,000s, the 100,000s, and the millions. Well, where do those come from? Well, those come from exponential numbers. Okay, we have 10 to the 0, right? Because it's base 10, so we have 10. We always start with the 0. Anything to the 0 is 1. Then we have our base 10 to the 1, which is just 10. We have base 10 squared, or to the 2, which means 10 times 10, which is 100. 10 cubed, or 10 to the 3rd, which is 10 times 10 times 10. And again, you can continue through here. That's how we come up with the values of those columns. The number selection that we can do in each of these columns is anywhere from 0 to 9. Why is this? Well, because it's what's called base 10, or the decimal numbering system. If it's base 10, it means there can be 10 choices in each column. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If we want to deal with binary, or what's also known as base 2, well, then we do the same thing. We start out with our base of 2, and we say to the 0 power, and anything to the 0 power is a 1. 2 to the 1st, which would be 2. 2 squared, which would be 2 times 2, which is 4. 2 cubed, which is 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. Now, before we go any further, let's just forget about all these exponential numbers. It's real simple. If you want to come up with the column values, because you'll notice it gets real crazy real quick, anything to the 0 is a 1. Okay, so let's just forget about that and put a 1 down here. Okay, we're just starting off simply with 1. And then we're going to multiply that by 2. This is the hard part, where you have to know how to multiply by 2. And you get 2. And you multiply by 2, and you get 4. Multiply by 2, you get 8. And just keep going. Just keep multiplying by 2, and you get 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, and 4096. And I'm going to stop there, and I have a reason that I'm going to stop there. Don't worry if you're struggling to multiply by 2, or if you can't do it as fast as I can. That's okay. And calculators are allowed if you need to. I prefer you learn how to do this without the calculator, but I won't hate you if you use one. So if we want to convert binary to decimal, right? You see this binary number. You see these ones and zeros, and you go, ah, what's that? Well, all you do is you treat it just like that number 3,482 that we had just a few moments ago. You take this number right here on the screen, 10101010. You create your column values, the 1's column, the 2's column, the 4's column, the 8's column, the 16's column, and so forth. And you go ahead and put the numbers into their columns. And then just like with decimal, we're going to say 1 times, and I'll start from the left this time. We'll say 1 times 128 is 128. 0 times 64 is 0. 1 times 32 is 32. 0 times 16 is 0. And you keep going all the way through until you have all your values and you add them up. Matter of fact, it's even easier than we had in the decimal numbering system, because 0 times anything is 0, and 1 times anything is itself. So all you have to do is any column value that has a 1, add that value in. Okay, so here we have a 1 under the 128s, the 32, the 8s, and the 2s. So we say 128 plus 32 plus 8 plus 2. And again, you can do this on paper, hopefully. And if you can't, I won't hate you if you use a calculator. But 8 plus 2 is 10, plus 8 is 18, plus 2 is 20. So we have 0, carry the 2. 2 times 2 is 4, plus 3 is 7, and then 1 is 1. There we go, 170. So what that means is the binary number 10101010 equals the decimal number 170. That's not so bad, right? It's not that bad. And if you're thinking, oh man, I can't do it. Again, slow down, take a deep breath, one step at a time. Just start with the number 1 and start multiplying by 2 and to get all your columns values. And then just put your 1s and 0s under it and add up all the values where a 1 is. That's it. Now, most people don't find this to be the more difficult process. What they do find to be the more difficult process is the other way around, converting a decimal number to binary. Right? It's not that hard to just put a bunch of 1s and 0s and just add up all the columns where there's a 1, right? But what about the other way around? Remember that number 3,482? Well, we're going to convert that to a binary number. Now, the way we do this is you look for the highest column value in binary that goes into 3,482 without going over. Okay, that's why when I went through and I was doing all my column values, I stopped at 4,096. The reason I stopped there is because, all right, I'm bigger than 3,482. So I know I don't even need that, right? I don't even need that guy there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this 2,048 and I'm going to put a 1 underneath. Okay, so we're going to put a 1 under 2,048, and then we're going to subtract it from 3,482. And again, hopefully maybe you can even do this on paper. I encourage it. I'll explain why I don't like the calculator, but just for now, let's see if we can do this on paper, right? You got 2 minus 8, so you got to borrow, right? And this 8 becomes a 7, and we make that 12 minus 8 is 4, 7 minus 4 is 3, 4 minus 0 is 4, 3 minus 2 is 1. We're left with 1,434. What we now want to do is look for the highest column value that goes into 1,434 without going over. And of course, that's going to be 1,024. Put a 1 under there, and then subtract it. And we're left with 410. What's the largest column that goes into that? Not 512. That's too big. 256. We put a 1 under there, subtract it. 128, subtract it. Now we got 26. We got to jump all the way down here to 16, put a 1 under it, subtract it. 10 would be 8. We're left with 2. 2 goes into 2, so we put a 1 under there, we end up with 0. That's good. We want to end up with 0. When we end up with 0, guess what we do? We take that 0 and we plug it in all the places there wasn't a 1. And we just converted a decimal number to binary. 3,482 is 1101100111010. Just that simple. Just addition, subtraction, and know how to multiply by 2. Now, if you want to use the calculator, go ahead. Let me pull up the calculator here. In Microsoft World, all of their operating systems come with a calculator. Now, depending on what operating system you're using, some of them, you'll go up to the View menu and you'll select Scientific, and you get this more advanced calculator. Now, I'm on Windows 7, and in Windows 7, you don't want Scientific because they don't have what I need on here. I want to go to Programmer. Now, how will you know which one you should go to? You want to go to the one that has these options right here: hex, decimal, octal, and binary. And the reason we do that is because now, in decimal, if I put in 3,482, right, that's our decimal number, and I just click this button that says binary, boom, that's it. It converted it for us. 1101100111010, just like we had down here. Oh, I apologize. I just made the calculator go away. There we go. Just like we had down here. Now, if we wanted to go the other way around, we could come up here and we could say 10101010. I don't know if you remember what that was, but that is the binary number that we started out with that we then click decimal. Boom. It's 170, just like we saw before. The reason that I caution you on using the calculator is because ones and zeros can get very easily jumbled together, depending on how good your eyes are, and even with key punching. You know, a simple 1 or a 0 gets messed up, and you have a whole different answer. I mean, to show you an example, here's binary. I'm going to put in 1101100111010. That almost looks just like what I have down here, right? But you may have caught that I put an extra 0 in here. When I convert that to decimal, look at that, not even close to 3,482. It's 6,938. That's why I caution use of the calculator. But if you need to use it, I won't hate you for it. All right, so now you hopefully can do the math if you were forced to do it. Right? If you get put in a situation you have to do some math, convert decimal to binary, binary to decimal, hopefully you can do it now. Even if you have to use the calculator, that's okay. And this is very important, because if you're thinking to yourself, well, that's great, Ed, but who really cares? I mean, why? Why do I care about converting these numbers? Well, everything when it comes to IP addressing and learning how this stuff all really works is all about understanding the binary aspect of it. And so even though we normally see things in a decimal fashion like 192.168, we have to realize it's a bunch of ones and zeros, and that's what really makes things work. So here are some of those rules that we saw previously, where each of the 4 numbers in an IP address is called an octet because it's actually 8 bits, each bit representing a 1 or a 0, and each octet can only have a number from 0 to 255. Again, the reason is because all zeros would be 0, and all ones, if you add up all the columns, if you add up those first 8 columns, 128 plus 64 plus 32 plus 16 plus 8 plus 4 plus 2 plus 1, I hope I didn't miss one there. If you add those all up together, you get 255. And this, of course, makes it a little bit easier if you see it right here. If you add all these up, you get 255. So we take an IP address like 192.168.10.101, and what we have to do is take that 192 and convert it to binary, and you get 11000000. You take the 168 and you convert it, and you get 10101000. You take the 10 and you make it 00001010. By the way, when dealing with IP addresses, each number is specifically 8 bits. And so what that means is, even though 10 really converts to just 1010, you need to put the preceding zeros. You got to make it 8 bits long. And then 101 is 011000101. So that means that this 192.168.10.101 that we're used to seeing is actually this right here in binary. This big, long set of 32 ones and zeros. Now, when it comes to subnet masks, it still works the same way. When we saw 255.255.255.0, what we were really saying is 11111111111 all the way to this point, and then a bunch of zeros for the last octet. And so what that means is that the subnet mask is not truly, you know, it's earlier today when I told you 255s represent the network ID and zeros represent the host ID, that wasn't completely true. It's all the ones in the subnet mask represent the network ID, and the zeros represent the host ID. So here is what everything looks like in binary, right? We're used to seeing this, but the reality is this is what we need to be familiar with to understand how things truly work. All right, we're going to take a step away for just a brief moment, as far as away from the math part, and learn about this thing called a router. A router is a device that forwards data packets along networks. A router is connected to blah, 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 blah. Do you really think I was going to read that whole thing to you? That's just some definition I pulled off a website somewhere. The bottom line is that a router is a device that can connect two different networks so that they can communicate with one another. In other words, by default, a computer can only communicate with other computers on its own network. Right? Mentioned that earlier. Right? I showed you that simple network, and computers, you know, they can only communicate with the other computers on their own network. If they want to communicate with computers on another network, they have to go through a router. Now, we see routers used in many different places. We can have a router just within our own network, where you just may have two different segments of a network with different IP ranges, and they are connected within the office by a router. You may have a router separating your office from the internet. Your home is connected very often with a cable modem or DSL router, which, by the way, this device is also a NAT box, so something that performs NAT, network address translation. That's how, when you're at home and you look at your home computer and you see 192.168, you can still get on the internet. And then here's an example where we may have maybe like a main office and a branch office, and they are then being connected with a couple of routers. These are all very typical uses of routers. Here's an example of a bunch of routers in an overall corporate environment, right? You got your main office with a bunch of different segments and routers branching off these different segments, plus a router connecting you to the internet, possibly also connecting you out to the branch office. Maybe there's another branch office who has a router who goes to the internet and through the internet gets over to the main office. You may have a home user, right? Telecommuters going through their cable modem router out to the internet, and so on and so forth. This is a lot of different uses of routers. Now, why does this matter? Well, because I want you to be familiar with a term called default gateway. Like I said before, computers can only communicate directly with other computers on the same network. If they want to communicate with a computer on another network, it has to be through a router. And this is what's known as internetworking. The default gateway represents the IP address of the router that a computer uses to communicate outside its network. In other words, the default gateway is the IP address of a router that the computer will go to when it wants to leave its network. So we go back to our simple network. Again, we have a client and a server and a router, all with IP addresses on the same network. But you'll notice that the client and the server have a default gateway pointing at the IP address of a router. That way, if this client or this server wants to communicate outside of its network, or in this case, in this simple network, it would be the internet, it knows to send those pieces of information, or send that communication to the router. So now that we know about networks and different networks and communicating between them, this is where we're going to get to the answer on a whole lot of the things that you guys were asking about in the Q&A. Subnetting is the process of taking a large network and dividing it into smaller networks to increase efficiency and manageability. So here we have an example of a network that's using the 172.16 network, which has 65,534 possible hosts. That's a large number. Could you imagine 65,000 computers all in one single network? You're trying to manage that all as one component? That's crazy. So what we can do is we can subnet it. We can take that B-class range of 172.16, which had 255.255.0.0, and change the subnet mask to 255.0. Okay, so we draw our line here and make it that we have three different subnets in the example here of 172.16.1, .2, and .3. And each one of those individual subnets has 254 hosts. Okay, a much more manageable number. Now this is where we come back to something I promised you we'd get back to as far as the problems with classful IP addressing. Remember our Class A that has almost 17 million hosts, and Class B with 65,000, and Class C with 250? Well, what happens if you have a company and there's 2,000 computers in your company? What do? Well, we can either go out there and get a Class B address, which has 65,000, plenty. Matter of fact, it's too much, because now you're wasting 63,000 addresses. You've just reserved 65,000 addresses that nobody else can use out on the internet. You're only using 2,000 of them. How selfish of you. The other option is you could have 8 Class C networks and have cluttered routing table entries. Now, this all has to do with actual live internet IP addresses. So this is kind of a thing of the past. We don't see too much of this anymore. And the reason is because of, well, this mess that was being created. So the solution is something called classless interdomain routing with variable length subnet masks. And don't worry, by the way, I do notice that we're right at about an hour right now. I only need a few more minutes just to get through the rest of this. So any of you that have to get going, maybe you're on your lunch break or something, I'm going to wrap this up real quick here. We're just about at the end. Classless interdomain routing, variable length subnet mask is what's going to allow us to do better than just 65,000 or 250. Or really, I could say 17 million or 65,000 or 250. When using a decimal subnet mask, those were our choices, right? We could only draw the line on the dots, right? You could only put a line actually on a dot. But when we break this down to binary bits, where we have individual ones and zeros, we actually have 32 different numbers, which means we have 31 different breaking points. We can move this line to the left or to the right, okay, or put it wherever we want to put it. Now what happens in the subnet mask is you may not end up with all ones or all zeros because you may be splitting it down the middle. And that's why sometimes you'll see a subnet mask that ends with 254 or 252 or 248, 240, 224, 192, or 128. It's because, again, I'm just doing the binary math here depending on exactly where we're drawing the line. If we were to start with that Class B range but want to divide it into smaller networks, we need to take bits from the host ID and move them into the network ID. Okay, so here's our original right here where we have 2 octets are the network ID and 2 octets of the host ID. With subnetting, we're going to actually steal from the host ID. And we're going to now extend our network ID from here. We're going to go 5 bits further into it. And this is what some people call the subnet ID, although it's really just, this whole thing is now the network ID. And then we're left with a smaller host ID. Okay, so we have a few different subnets that we can create, and then a range, a variable range of the quantity of hosts that we can have in each one of those networks. Now, here's where we get back to regular math. There's some formulas here. The number of bits that we put into the subnet ID, so in this case we stole these 5 extra bits for the subnet ID, that's the number of subnets that we could create within this network. So 2 to the n, 2 to the 5th, okay, right down here, would be 32 subnets. The number of hosts that are then available, right, with what's left here, the number of bits that are left with the 0, so we have 8, 9, 10, 11, you get 2 to the 11th minus 2. Why is it minus 2? Because again, remember, the host ID cannot be all zeros or all ones. So 2 to the 11th minus 2 is 2,046 available hosts in each subnet. So in the scenario where you have 2,000 computers and you want to be able to create a network that just covers those 2,000, what some of the original internet service providers started doing was they would go ahead and grab the huge 65,000 or even 17 million host ranges, and then they would subnet it down and just give you the range of 2,046. So here we have our simple network again, but one thing has changed I want you to notice. Notice that my subnet mask is now 255.255.255.248. Okay, so I have subnetted this down. This last number, this 4th octet, has been broken in half. So what that means is, guess what? This network is actually an example of a bad network. This network won't work. Why won't it work? It won't work because we have to break this down into binary. Here are the IP addresses of our client, server, and router. We're going to take these and break them down into binary IP addresses. Then we have our subnet mask. Break that down into a binary subnet mask. And what that means is now the ones, see, the line's not here anymore. It's been moved over. The line is now here. And so for these to all be on the same network, that means that all of this whole section right here, must match. And you'll notice that they're all the same, they're all the same, they're all the same, they're all the same. Uh-oh, we don't have a match here, which means they're not all on the same network. That's why it won't work. So how can we fix it? Well, with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.248, each network is broken into blocks of 6 host addresses. Why is it 6? because we're left with 3 bits at the end. 2 to the third is 8 minus 2 leaves you with 6. And here's how that works out. Here's the 8 possible choices, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? You got this whole range here. Those are every single possible choice of ones and zeros that we could put into the host ID. And if we convert these back to decimal, you see we get 192.168.10.0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We have to cross out the 0 because that represents the network ID. We have to cross out the 7 because that would be the broadcast ID. That leaves us with the numbers 1 through 6. The next range would be if we, and let me go back so you can see the change. Right here in the network ID, I'm going to change a 0 to a 1 all the way down. And again, we have the same list of 8 host addresses. You get 8 through 15, but you can't do 8 because that's the network ID. Can't do 15, that's the broadcast ID. You get 9 through 14, all on that network. So if we go back to our first network that we had, and we need to have 3 IP addresses, one for the server, one for the client, and one for the router, you get 1, 2, and 3. Those would all work together, right? So how do we fix our simple network? Now our router is .1, our server is .2, and our client is .3, and they are all talking to each other once again. Oh, by the way, notice that the default gateway for the client and the server are both pointing over here to the IP address of our router. Now, remember that question that came up during the break as far as, 10 dot, I don't remember the IP address, whatever, /24. Well, that's what's called a CIDR notation. Without CIDR notation, we have an IP address and a subnet mask. With a CIDR notation, we just simply put the IP address / the number of bits that are in the network ID. Okay, because this would be 8 bits, 8 bits, 8 bits, and 5 more bits, which is 29. Okay, that's where that 29 comes from. All right, that brings us to the end. I apologize that I did go a little bit over here. Told you at the beginning this is a lot of information to try to cram into an hour. I normally actually take an hour and a half to 2 hours, so this was very, very fast. Again, if you found yourself getting lost, don't worry about it. It was very, very quick paced. We talked about what the IP address is, right? How it's these 2 components, the network ID and the host ID, and how to decide on a range that's appropriate for your network. We learned how to convert IP addresses from decimal to binary and then back to decimal again. Very important to understand how things are really working. Learned what a router is and how we interconnect between networks. And finally, subnetting. So before we go, let me go ahead and I'll tell you what, before I get to these questions, because I see there's a number of questions still hanging out there, real quick, for those of you that have to go, and I see we did lose 10 or 20 people or so, real quick, thank you for coming. I hope this is not the last I hear from you. I don't like when this is one-way communication. I don't like when I'm just spewing all this out to you. I know we have a little Q&A here. But please, please, please stay in touch. Feel free to find me on Facebook. You can either find me by my name, Ed Liberman. I have a personal Facebook page. You can friend me if you want, although you're going to hear all about my kids and my vacations and all that fun stuff. Or more specifically, you can become a fan of my professional page, which is Train Signal Ed. But I have been told that some people have trouble finding Train Signal Ed, and I think it's because I put Train Signal space Ed, and it gets a little weird. So if you need to, go ahead and friend me on my personal page, and then I'll give you a link to the Train Signal Ed page. You can also follow me on Twitter, although I don't do a whole lot on Twitter right now. I'm trying to become more and more active there. You can also get involved with Train Signal by coming to our blog, becoming a fan of our Facebook fan page, or follow us on Twitter. So let me jump back to some Q&A. Let's see what we have here. Supernetting. What does supernetting mean? Supernetting is the opposite of subnetting. Subnetting is taking one large network and breaking it down into a bunch of smaller networks. Well, supernetting is something we used to do in the past. Remember that example where there's 2,000 computers and you had to take 8 Class C ranges, or I should say, well, yeah, it really would be ranges or networks. It's taking those 8 Class C networks and putting them all together. That's super netting. NAT versus PAT. I talked about network address translation. PAT is port address translation, okay, where you go ahead and have certain ports translate. I apologize. You can always shoot me a message on Facebook or something, and I can get you a more specific answer on that or links to articles on that. I mentioned about Class D and E. Let's see here. I see there's some IPv6 stuff. Again, you can feel free to ask me this stuff directly. I just can't get to it right here. Wildcard mask. That's the second time somebody asked me about wildcard. And again, I have to be honest with you. I just don't even understand the question. A wildcard mask. I'm not understanding the term. It's probably something I'm familiar with, and I just know it by some other name. Is a NAT server the same as our router? It may be. Okay, a NAT server, very often, your internet router, whether it be at home, like I talked about, or even in a corporate environment, very often is acting as a NAT server as well. I'm being asked to show the classes and subnet masks again. I can't easily get back to that screen. George, this will be recorded, and you can play it back later, but I can also tell you that Class A is just 255 and then 3 zeros. Class B is 255, 255, 00, and Class C is where you have 3 255s and 1 0. I see that the Australian said that he is Australian, so hopefully I didn't offend him saying New Zealand, right? But some books say 127.0.0.0 is the loopback address. I've never actually seen that. To me, 127.0.0.0 is the network ID for that diagnostic network. I could be wrong. Of course, those books could also be wrong. But I can tell you, and I can actually back this up. 127.0.0.1 is what is most commonly known as the loopback address. If I give a Class A IP address with manually subnet 222.55.0, why such customizations are done? Actually, this person has left, unfortunately, but for everyone else, it's a good question. Why would you do it? I hope I explained that during the lesson. It's because you don't want to have one big network of 17 million. That's why you do that. How soon do we need IPv6 on our private networks? I don't think, that's the million-dollar question. People have claimed IPv6 would already be here and be dominating by now, and it's just not the case. Network address translation has helped us. Well, subnetting in the first place, but then network address translation has made it that IPv4 can survive for a very long time. In some people's opinions, IPv4 can last forever. Other people's opinions where you need to, every single human is going to get an IP address. Talking about barcoding and IP addressing humans when they're born and all that fun stuff. If you're a believer in that, then obviously IPv4 can't do all that, even with network address translation. In your calculating binary, do you always place the larger number value working down to the small number left to right? Yes, you do. Just like in the decimal numbering system, the ones column is always on the right, and you grow towards the left. And the only thing I will say to that is, I suppose in other countries and other languages, if it's looked at differently, I apologize. I'm ignorant to that. I don't know if that's done. So, but definitely, as far as I know, with all numbering systems, that is how it's supposed to work. What is the difference between the network ID and the network address? Both have 32 bits, 24, 30. Okay, the network ID and the network address pretty much are the same thing. When you're asking what is the difference, they are pretty much the same thing. The network ID, as I was referring to it, would be the, just saying 192.168.10, whereas the actual network address is 192.168.10.0. Again, another person's asking about PAT versus NAT. By all means, shoot me a direct question out on Facebook, and I will get you very, very direct answers on that. Just not time to go into a lesson. How do you set up a DMZ, a demilitarized zone? Again, Peter, great question, but it's going to have to be taken offline. Shoot me a direct message. Matter of fact, I think, Peter, I just saw that I got a friend request from you on Facebook, so just shoot me the message on Facebook, and we'll go from there. What do we have here? Can you subnet a network which has a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0? Yes, as we saw at the very end, I subnetted it all the way down to 255.255.255.248. Difference between an IP address and a MAC address. A MAC address is the hexadecimal, so that would be base 16. That's a physical hardware address for the actual network card, versus the IP address is a logical address as it's looked at within the network and looked at within internetworking, really to be more specific, because the MAC address can be used once you're on a local network with another computer, and it is actually used, but the IP address is what is first used to get to the right network. Someone is explaining wildcard mask is used in Cisco routing configuration. Thank you, Francisco, for clarifying that, and I'm going to be straight up honest with you guys. I know very little to nothing about Cisco routing and how to configure Cisco routers, so unfortunately I can't answer that for you. A couple more questions, then we're going to wrap this up here. A lot of these are just people saying thanks, and you're very welcome. Matter of fact, I thank you for taking the time to sit and listen to me. Somebody just confirmed that if you try to ping 127.0.0.0, you just get a general failure. But if you do 127.0.0.1, it works. Like I said, I can confirm that as well, but that's in Microsoft world. There could be other areas where 127.0.0.0 might work. Let's see here. Could I recommend you a good online resource for this topic? Well, I don't know which topic, unless you mean the whole webinar as a whole, and I'm going to say the online resources. There's plenty of them that we have actually right on Train Signal's website through our own blogs. The courses that I have here, Microsoft, you can go to Microsoft, TechNet articles and things like that. There's a lot of stuff out there. And if we have an IP address, then can we avoid using the MAC address? No, MAC addresses are always, always, always used. It would be a whole nother 20 minutes of lesson if I really wanted to get into how that works. There's something called ARP, the Address Resolution Protocol, which is what converts an IP address to a MAC address. And it looks like that is just about the end. Let's see here. If you don't use the default gateway on the client, will that stop them from getting to the internet? That is correct. Unless they have an individual routing entry that tells them how to get there, and that's getting real sophisticated, you know, no. If you don't have a default gateway, you're not going anywhere. All right, guys and gals, we are well past our time. We're about 20 minutes past, and it looks like I've gotten to most of the questions. If you still have questions, again, I want to emphasize, don't feel like, oh, man, he missed mine, because I might have. There were a lot of questions here if I skipped over it, or don't feel like I'm unwilling to answer it. Feel free to go to Train Signal's forums and throw the questions out there. There are a lot of people who can answer them, or sometimes they'll get back to me and then I'll answer them. You can shoot me a message directly on Facebook, and I can try to answer it for you there. The only thing I ask is please be patient. I don't, I have other responsibilities besides just sitting on Facebook all day. Fortunately, I have a job that allows me to sit on Facebook for at least part of my day, which is nice, but I can't be there the whole day. I have other things to do, so please be patient. If it takes me a day or two to get back to you, sometimes I do get a lot of questions. So that's it. I'm going to go ahead and pass this back to Stephanie. She'll wrap it up, and you all have a great day.
All right, everyone, that's all the time we have today. Thanks again for attending and for your participation. As a reminder, today's webinar was recorded and will be available to view tomorrow morning at trainsignal.com/blog/webinars, and we'll also email you the link. And remember, as you leave, to fill out the survey for a chance to win the Microsoft MTA Networking Fundamentals Training Course, or I'm sorry, the CompTIA Network Plus training course. We will email the winner. Thanks again and have a great day. Bye-bye.